We have all seen over the years press conferences and this, that, and the other of massive drug busts where there's a table full of cash that the law enforcement had been able to confiscate from criminals through civil asset forfeiture. And we expect those kinds of things when criminal behavior is involved. But a disturbing trend has been taking place for years where civil asset forfeiture has been applied to American citizens, where the government has come after them, seized their assets that they have for their business or whatever, in spite of the fact that they have done zero criminal activity. And because this is a civil asset forfeiture, the government is not required to give the money back. What do they think we are? A bunch of ATM machines running around that they can just come and take cash out of our pockets whenever they want to? Well, that's what you would think. Now, it is technically, because of a law a few years back, illegal for our government agencies to participate in that. But now they are doing so by giving $6 billion to private companies to continue the work of civil asset forfeiture against American citizens. So let's just circumvent the law. This is what's going on. Well, joining me now to discuss this is Dan Alban. He's a senior attorney at the Institute for Justice and the co-director of its national initiative to end forfeiture. Dan, thank you so much for joining us this evening on Washington Watch.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's our pleasure. All right, I try to give a little overview. What have I missed? Fill in the gaps for me, please.
Sure. So civil forfeiture is actually not something that government agencies are prohibited from participating in. They very actively do it. But because it is such a big business, particularly for federal agencies, they hire independent contractors, private contractors, and they just recently issued over $6 billion in contracts to private contractors over the next 5 years. And that really highlights the degree to which federal agencies are targeting Americans for civil forfeiture. If they're going to spend $6 billion on investigations, on processing paperwork, on all the other administrative things that need to be done for civil forfeiture, I think that shows how much they're bringing in each year by seizing property from people. And then they can do this without charging them with a crime and permanently keep your property. So that's the real danger. It's a threat to property rights. It's a threat to civil liberties. And it's something that does not require a criminal charge, let alone a criminal conviction.
Yeah, that's what's so disturbing about this. And I actually was on the Oversight Committee when we dealt with this specific thing with the IRS, specific to the IRS. So I suppose the law that I referenced dealt specifically with them. But other agencies, as you refer to, are still allowed to participate in this type of stuff. And it is. I mean, there's $45 billion that has been seized from American citizens just in the between 2019 and 2020 alone. This is just phenomenal, and it's wrong in every way. And as you mentioned, they don't have to give the money back. It's almost like, Dan, is it not? It's almost like a government-sanctioned mafia that's being developed here.
Well, the problem is that it's actually legal. It's legalized theft. And so that figure that you mentioned, the $45 billion, that's from 2000 to 2019 at the federal level, but that only includes federal agencies. And so it doesn't include state and local law enforcement. And the total for all of those together from 2000 to 2019 is nearly $70 billion. So this is a huge profit maker for these agencies. And what I think a lot of people don't realize is that in most states and at the federal level, these agencies actually get to keep the money that they seize. It goes into funds that are controlled by law enforcement. And that's counter to what the Constitution says. The Constitution creates a separation of powers. There's supposed to be the power of the purse, which is controlled by Congress, and the power of the sword, the executive, which is the executive agencies. And you're not supposed to have the agencies with the power of the sword also controlling the purse. But that's what we have with civil forfeiture. The agencies that seize the property get to spend that very money.
Fantastic word picture there in laying that out for us. Now, you have, in the Institute for Justice, you have been personally, directly involved with several cases. I know even some Christians that have had money confiscated even for mission trips and that type of stuff. Give us some of the horror stories. What are some of the cases that you personally have been involved with, and what the type of things that you're seeing, just so we can kind of highlight this for our viewers and listeners?
Sure. So I spend my time litigating forfeiture cases on behalf of property owners. We represent them pro bono for free at the Institute for Justice because we're a nonprofit. And we've had several cases where Christians who are traveling for either mission or charitable purposes with large amounts of cash had that seized on the suspicion that they were somehow involved in illegal activity. But they weren't. They weren't involved in anything illegal. They weren't doing anything wrong. Nonetheless, they got caught up in this forfeiture system. We had one client who was a lady originally from Nigeria. She came to the U.S. over 40 years ago, was living here as a nurse, working here, and wanted to, as her mission, open up a medical clinic in her home village in Nigeria for women and children who did not have access to medical care. So she saved up her money for many years, and she was flying back to Nigeria. And as she boarded her flight, she was pulled aside by Customs and Border Protection, and they seized over $40,000 that was intended for this medical clinic. And they kept it for months and months, prevented her from being able to establish this clinic anywhere near the time frame she wanted to. In another case, we represented a Christian rock band that was on a tour of the United States, raising money for orphans in Thailand and for a Christian college that was being established in Burma. And they were making this tour of a number of churches across the United States, and they were raising money mostly in cash. And their band manager was stopped in Muskogee, Oklahoma, because he had a broken taillight. And they seized all of the money that the band had raised in over 3 months of touring, over $53,000, simply because he had a broken taillight and he was in a car with $53,000 in cash. And they thought, well, he must be somehow involved in drug dealing. But he wasn't. He didn't smoke. He didn't drink. He was a volunteer for his church who was helping to manage this band on their U.S. charity tour. Now, eventually, because of our representation, we were able to get the money returned for both the band and for Antonia, the lady who was going to Nigeria to start the medical clinic. But most people aren't so fortunate. And if missionaries, orphans, and refugees can be victimized by civil forfeiture, anyone can be victimized by civil forfeiture. That's why it's such a danger.
Absolutely. And I think most people understand it when there's criminal activity. All right? And that's the intent of this. If a person has gotten a lot of money by selling drugs or whatever, that's one thing. I'm curious, the figures that you referenced a while ago, the $70 billion, does that include the criminal forfeiture as well as non-criminals? Is it all kind of lumped together? How do those figures, do you know the discrepancy in the figures?
Yeah, so those totals include criminal forfeiture, but we know from the federal reporting on the use of forfeiture that the vast majority of forfeiture is done at the civil level. With some agencies, it's 96% of all forfeitures are done through civil courts. In others, it's about 80%. But either way, the vast majority of forfeitures are civil in nature. And that means there's a lower burden of proof. The person doesn't have a right to an attorney, and they don't have any of the other rights that a criminal defendant has. There's no requirement that they be charged with a crime or convicted of a crime. And that's a huge problem because we're punishing someone for committing a crime without actually securing a conviction. And it's important that Congress take action to address this. There's pending legislation called the FAIR Act, H.R. 1525, that would make a number of important reforms to federal forfeiture laws to protect Americans from these predatory practices.
Is that the Wahlberg bill, by chance?
It is, yes. It is a bipartisan bill sponsored by Representative Wahlberg. It was just passed 26 to 0 out of the House Judiciary Committee with the support of Representative Jim Jordan. And we believe it's headed to the fall, to the House floor this fall.
Okay, good. Well, I knew he had that bill going forward, so we will certainly be keeping a pulse on that. I think it's an extremely important bill. And this is horrifying news to think that the government can come and take these type of funds from people without any warrant, without any due process, without any crime having been committed. And now they are giving $6 billion to private companies to help them do more of the same. It really is just in every way disturbing. Final word for us. What can people do? What can people do if they find themselves in this situation? About 30 seconds.
Well, I think the most important thing right now is to call your representative and support the FAIR Act, HR 1525. There's very little that any individual can do when they get caught in these situations. And that's why we need to end it at a systemic level. And it's up to Congress to pass legislation to protect our rights.
Dan Alban with the Institute for Justice, thank you so much for coming on Washington Watch this evening. Very disturbing topic, but thank you for unfolding it for us. God bless you.
Thank you.